All right, let's talk about something big. We're going to unmask one of the most powerful, influential, and, let's be real, controversial ways of looking at our world: realism. It's this lens, right? It just cuts through all the diplomatic fluff and shows you this raw, timeless, and often kind of tragic struggle for power and survival. So yeah, let's get into it. I mean, you look at the world and you have to wonder, right? Why do wars still happen? With everything we've achieved, why do conflicts keep breaking out? And can nations ever truly, really trust each other? These are the big questions at the heart of it all. And realism, well, it has some pretty stark and, frankly, uncomfortable answers for us. First up, the realist worldview. So, what is this thing really? At its core, realism is just a framework. It's built on a few really foundational and pretty tough assumptions about how the world actually works. It's all about stripping away what we wish things were and instead looking at what realists believe they are. So realism basically stands on 5 main pillars, and they all kind of build on each other. It kicks off with a pretty dark view of human nature, this idea that deep down we're all self-interested. That leads right into point 2. States, not big international groups, are the main players on the world stage. Why? Because they're the ultimate expression of that collective self-interest. Okay, so if that's true, then it follows that the world is inherently a place of conflict, where when push comes to shove, force decides things. And that means the number one goal for every single state boils down to just one thing: survival. And if all that is true, well, then you can see why realists are so skeptical about lasting progress. They tend to see history as just one big repeating cycle of power struggles. And here's the absolute key to all of this. The concept that holds it all together is anarchy. Now, hold on, that doesn't mean chaos and riots in the streets, not at all. In world politics, anarchy just means there's no world government. There's no global 911 you can call for help. Every country has to look out for itself. It's a self-help system. And that one fact changes everything. It's the structure of the world that, for realists, forces countries to behave the way they do. What's wild is that these ideas aren't new, not by a long shot. They were actually first observed and written down by some incredibly sharp thinkers thousands of years ago. So to really get realism, we've got to go back in time, way back, to its ancient architects. So our first stop is ancient Greece, and we're meeting the historian Thucydides. Now, this guy wasn't just writing down what happened. He was doing some of the first ever deep dive political analysis, trying to figure out the real structural reasons for this absolutely catastrophic war that just ripped the Greek world apart. And this quote right here, it just nails his main takeaway. He basically said the war wasn't about different beliefs or bad leadership or some big misunderstanding. No. He argued it was inevitable. And why? Because of a massive shift in power. Athens was on the rise, and that made the established power, Sparta, deeply afraid. And it was that fear, caused by this changing balance of power, that basically lit the fuse for the whole thing. And that one observation gives us what we today call hegemonic war theory. You might have even heard it called the Thucydides trap. It's this timeless idea that the most dangerous moment in world politics is when a new, rising power starts to challenge the dominant ruling one. I mean, just think about the tensions today between the United States and China. For a realist, that is a textbook example of the exact same dynamic Thucydides was talking about thousands of years ago.
And this might be the most brutal and the most famous line in all of realist thought. It comes from the Melian dialogue. Basically, the super powerful Athenians show up at the tiny island of Melos and demand they surrender. The Melians try to argue about justice and what's fair, and the Athenians shut them down with this one chilling line. For realists, this is it. This is the essence of power politics. Morality, it takes a back seat to the raw reality of who has more power.
Yeah, and Thucydides wasn't the only one thinking this way. Other classical thinkers built on these ideas. You had Machiavelli, who was all about the cunning and strength a leader needs to make sure their state survives. And then there's Thomas Hobbes, who came up with this brilliant concept of this security dilemma, where the more one country does to make itself safe, the more it makes its neighbors feel unsafe. All these guys really laid the groundwork for how to think and act in a pretty dangerous world. Fast forward now to the 20th century, because this is where the theory really starts to evolve. Thinkers started to debate, okay, where does this constant struggle for power actually come from? Is it really just because people are flawed, or is there something bigger, something structural going on.
And that debate created the main split in modern realism. On one side, you have the classical realists. They stuck with the original idea, arguing the root cause is just human nature, our built-in lust for power. But then this new school of thought popped up, called neorealism, or sometimes structural realism, and they said, nope, you've got it wrong. The cause isn't human nature, it's the structure of the international system. It's the anarchy.
So let's really zero in on that difference. For a classical realist like Morgenthau, the problem is internal. It's that human drive for power. But for Kenneth Waltz, who's basically the father of neorealism, the problem is totally external. He argued that it doesn't matter if a country's leaders are good people or bad people. The system itself, that anarchy with no one to call for help, forces every country to scramble for power just to stay safe.
Okay, that brings us right up to today, and to what is probably the most aggressive version of this whole theory, one that makes some pretty intense predictions about how the big global powers are going to act. We're talking about offensive realism, and the name you need to know here is John Mearsheimer. What he does is he takes the near-realist logic and just cranks it up to 11. He basically says, look, in this anarchic world, just having enough power to be secure is not enough. The only way to be truly 100% safe is to have more power than everyone else. The ultimate goal is hegemony, total dominance. But here's the catch. He says global hegemony is pretty much impossible. The world's just too big and oceans get in the way. So the real, achievable goal is regional hegemony. That means dominating your own backyard so completely that none of your neighbors can even think about threatening you. The classic example is the United States in the Americas. And what offensive realism predicts is that other rising powers, like China, are going to try to do the exact same thing in their own neighborhood. Now, this is a really interesting, kind of counterintuitive idea from neorealists. They actually argue that a bipolar world, a world with just two great powers, like the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, is the most stable. And the reason is, it's simple. Each side only has to worry about the other guy. The calculations are clearer, and there's less room for a deadly miscalculation. A world with lots of great powers, a multipolar world, is way more chaotic and, they argue, much more likely to lead to a major war. So, okay, after all this doom and gloom about human nature and inevitable conflict, you might be wondering, why do we even bother with this theory? Why is realism still considered one of the most essential tools for understanding the world? What's the big takeaway here? Well, here's what it boils down to. First, realism gives us a powerful, if grim, explanation for why war keeps happening, even when everyone says they want peace. It hammers home the point that for any country, national security comes first, period. It forces you to see international relations as, fundamentally, a struggle for power. And finally, it acts as a really important reality check against overly idealistic hopes of changing the world overnight. And that leaves us with this one last, really challenging question. If the realists are right, does that mean the whole idea of a lasting global peace is more than just a nice dream? Is it actually a dangerous illusion? One that could leave a country vulnerable if it lets its guard down? It's a deeply uncomfortable question for sure, but it's the one that realism forces us to face.